Close your eyes and imagine. The date is March 24th, 1603. You are walking through the quiet, dim corridors of Whitehall Palace. The most powerful woman in Europe has just passed away. Yet what the royal physicians are about to discover will upend everything historians thought they knew about the Virgin Queen. What makes this story extraordinary is not merely the moment of Elizabeth's death. She did not depart with her secrets. On the contrary, she died carrying on her very body the traces that would reveal the hidden life of the Tudor court, the backstage of royal splendor, and the deadly price of sustaining power through beauty. What you are about to hear is not just another tale of palace intrigue. According to many contemporary sources and modern forensic analysis, Elizabeth's body contained such physical evidence that some historians argue it was intentionally concealed from official records. We are speaking of a queen who bore the marks of decades-long poisoning, a woman who had drifted almost entirely away from the famed beauty of her youth. But the narrative does not begin with Elizabeth's final breath. The curtain rises with a single event that would completely alter the course of her life, and years later, draw her toward a mysterious end. In October 1562, at just 29 years old, one of the most terrifying diseases of the age came to her door: smallpox. Standing back from the brink of smallpox, Elizabeth's fate forked not only in regard to her health, but also her public image. The great rupture we can trace in court daybooks and ambassadorial reports after the 1562 crisis pulled her into a regime of appearance, an increasingly rigid routine reliant on cosmetics to preserve the perception of pallor, smoothness, and youth. When the extraordinary quantities of Venetian ceruse, a lead-based whitener, recorded in the palace account books are combined with period beauty treatises describing its application, layered on and left for days, the possibility that lead seeped through the skin and caused systemic poisoning grows stronger. Modern medical literature, linking lead to hair loss, enamel damage, skin injury, and even fatal outcomes, makes the picture medically plausible. Still, some historians, especially figures like Anna Reel and Kate Maltby, remind us that direct evidence of how regularly and to what degree Elizabeth used ceruse is limited, and that Victorian writers may have exaggerated the narrative. Thus, we must hold in view the tension between widespread usage and gaps in the evidence. Even so, contemporary testimonies regarding the 1562 Hampton Court crisis point to a contradiction between the Spanish ambassador Álvaro de la Cuadra's report that the young queen would not show her face for some time, and other courtiers' notes claiming she emerged almost unmarked, a contradiction that feeds the suspicion that the true damage was kept behind the scenes. Museum and archival studies detailing the English court's health alarm in autumn 1562 confirmed the gravity of the crisis. Envoys wrote that Elizabeth might die within days. This environment provides the backdrop for understanding how, in later years, cosmetics functioned not merely as aesthetic tools, but as political instruments. The toxic burden was not limited to lead. Cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was applied to the lips, and mercury-containing mixtures were recommended for removing makeup, turning daily rituals into a two-pronged mercury exposure. In Venetian reports of the 1570s, the progression of the queen's teeth, from white to yellow to rotted black, when set beside modern toxicology, provides a typical timeline for mercury poisoning. The clustering of such symptoms, skin/hair problems, enamel degradation, neurological fluctuations, suggests Elizabeth was living under an increasingly heavy neurotoxic load. The most naked moment when this regime of appearance slipped from stage to backstage is the famous episode in autumn 1599, when the Earl of Essex reportedly saw the Queen without wig and paint. Though accounts of Elizabeth being caught without her mask of youth may at first glance read like political slander, the rise in wig orders and the ladies-in-waiting's veiled notes about hair loss suggest the scene may not have been wholly fabricated. The episode appears as well in reliable summaries and updated compendia used by Tudor historians. The damage was not only surface deep, the mind also bore the weight. Spanish diplomatic reports from the 1590s record long spells of staring into space, melancholic episodes, and behavioral fluctuations. Modern medicine notes that chronic exposure to lead and mercury can cause depression, anxiety, irritability, tremor, and speech-osh coordination disorders. In her final weeks, the cost was paid in the most painful way. The Queen lost her ability to speak. The decision of succession, being indicated by tracing a crown around her head with her hand, is recorded in her cousin Robert Carey's detailed account of the day of her death. Compilations in the Folger archives report that Elizabeth had lost her speech by March 23rd. This detail is one of the dramatic peaks of the story. The postmortem phase is the narrative's chilling extension. The unusually long embalming and the richly dressed wax effigy placed atop her coffin strengthen the likelihood that the real body was concealed from the public. Lady Elizabeth Southwell's account of the coffin splitting due to gas buildup, though controversial and a solitary testimony, cannot be declared entirely incompatible with modern forensic commentary that bodies carrying a heavy metal burden may exhibit unusual gas dynamics during decomposition. Reliable reference texts on Tudor funerary practices and Southwell's tale place the claim in the category of legend, but not impossibility. On top of all this, Westminster Abbey records state that the Queen's tomb, sealed in 1606, has not been opened. Therefore, definitive forensic tests, such as heavy metal screening of hair/tissue/bone, have not been possible. The encyclopedic assessment by the Royal Museums Greenwich notes that the cause of death cannot be confirmed in the absence of an autopsy, and that the potential contribution of lead-based cosmetics has long been debated. This uncertainty weaves a fine thread of scientific caution through the narrative. For Elizabeth, cosmetics were not only an aesthetic preference, but the language of power. While portrait workshops repeatedly reproduced the codes of flawless skin and timeless youth, court receptions, staged with choreography, consolidated the Queen's visual persona we might call the mask of youth. Pallor and smoothness served as a political asset countering anti-Protestant propaganda that trafficked in images of a decaying body. Thus, despite a toxic regimen, the maintenance of image overrode its bodily cost. There are also current scholarly notes that question the excessive makeup myth, highlighting limits in the evidence. The lead mercury exposure that began in the late 1560s became visible in the 1570s with dental-charged dermal findings, evolved in the 1590s into behavioral, neurological fluctuations, and by 1603 had reached the threshold of aphonia, loss of speech. Modern forensic syntheses on the long-term effects of neurotoxins support this slow and cumulative deterioration. However, in Elizabeth's case, measurable biomarker data, because the tomb remains sealed, are still lacking. After death, representation by a wax effigy may have functioned not only as homage, but also as a veil distancing the public from the actual body. Read alongside burial practices and the toxic load hypothesis, Southwell's splitting coffin tale cannot be entirely dismissed as myth. It remains a solitary and unverified testimony. For that reason, presenting claims, counter-evidence, modern interpretation together in the development section both enriches the narrative and strengthens it methodologically. The Westminster tomb, sealed for over 400 years, is the greatest unknown that adds tension to the story. Keratin-bound metal analysis in hair, lead isotope ratios in bone, and mercury accumulation in soft tissue could answer many questions if access were granted. But for now, we possess only indirect evidence and contemporary testimonies. This allows us to draw an epistemic line through the development. Here lie the limits of proof. In the years following the 1562 rupture, Elizabeth's mirrors reflected not only her face, but the pulse of the realm. Pallor was not a fashion, but a shield of legitimacy. Lead-white skin became a state image multiplied in portrait workshops. Yet the palace ledgers and envoys' reports told another story. The ruby gleam of cinnabar on the lips yielded within months to the quiet rule of mercury. The ceruse that leveled her face into a plane turned, over years, into a map of wounds that lead inscribed, patiently and relentlessly. In the 1570s, Venetian reports wrote of teeth turning black. In the 1590s, Spanish notes clung to melancholic surges and vacant stares. In the autumn of 1599, Essex's scene of a queen without her mask of youth though it smelled of politics, seemed tacitly confirmed from behind the curtain by swelling lines of wig orders and the lady's veiled whispers of baldness. In the final weeks, the voice too was lost. Cousin Carrie wrote that the sign of succession was given by tracing a crown with the hand. When death came, a ceremonial wax face smiled from atop the coffin. The real face, perhaps burdened by years, remained hidden. Read with scientific caution, Southwell's tale of the splitting coffin may not be pure fable, but it is not, on its own, proof. Yet one thing does not change. So long as the seal at Westminster remains closed to today's laboratories, Elizabeth's story will continue to sway, heavy as lead, on the scales between image and truth. The disease, with a mortality rate approaching 1 in 3 and leaving survivors' faces with permanent and terrifying scars, was recorded not only in legend, but in contemporary court documents. So much so that the Spanish ambassador Álvaro de la Cuadra reported the Queen would not appear in public for a while because of the disfigurement of her face. Yet another witness from the same days painted a completely different picture, saying Elizabeth had weathered the storm with hardly a mark. Read side by side, these conflicting testimonies whisper that the true damage to the Queen's face, perhaps by deliberate choice, was kept out of sight. Historians agree on this essential point. After 1562, a clear break occurred in Elizabeth's public appearance, drawing her into a deepening passion, indeed an obsession, for cosmetics. The palace ledgers meticulously record the extraordinary orders of Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based makeup. Period beauty books explain that it was applied in layers and left on the skin for days, allowing the poison to seep inward through the skin into the bloodstream. Thus, a strategy adopted to protect against the marks of disease slowly opened the door to a more insidious danger that lodged within the body and spread over the years. Nor was this the only toxic substance Elizabeth used. To color her lips, she used cinnabar containing mercury. Those red lips became part of her image, but mercury poisoning spread rapidly through the blood. Moreover, the mixture she used every day to remove her makeup contained eggshell, alum, and again, mercury. In other words, she was exposed to mercury twice a day. As the years passed, court observers began writing of disturbing changes in Elizabeth's appearance and behavior. In reports from the Venetian ambassador in the 1570s, it was written that the Queen's teeth turned from white to yellow and then to rotted black. Modern medicine says this is a typical result of mercury poisoning. In 1599, the Earl of Essex wrote that, by chance, he had the opportunity to see Elizabeth without her wig and heavy makeup, and that he was utterly stunned by what he saw. The scene he described was very different from the Queen he served. Bare skin showing every wrinkle, a bald head, and a face worn and damaged by time. This image was the exact opposite of the magnificent persona of the powerful ruler imprinted in memory. Though initially seen as exaggeration, the growing wig orders and the veiled references to hair loss in the ladies-in-waiting's diaries seemed to corroborate this description. Yet the matter was not confined to outward appearance. Elizabeth's mental health was equally shaken. Reports from Spanish envoys in the 1590s spoke of a queen who stared at walls for long stretches, plunged into deep melancholic crises. Such behavior overlaps closely with the symptoms of lead and mercury poisoning, which severely damage the nervous system. The period when she paid the price most painfully was her last weeks. Elizabeth could no longer speak, expressing herself only with hand movements. According to Robert Carey, she drew a crown around her head to approve her successor. The woman who once stirred armies with her words and enchanted her realm with her speeches ultimately lost her bond with her own voice and was condemned to silence, one of history's most bitter ironies. The days before her death were even more dramatic. Her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Southwell, wrote that the Queen stood for 15 hours, refusing to lie down. When she collapsed, court attendants had covered the floor with cushions. Elizabeth lay silently on the ground for 4 days before being moved to her bed. But the truly shocking detail came after death. Elizabeth had asked that her body not be opened. This was unusual for royalty. But her advisor, Robert Cecil, ignored this request and ordered the standard procedure of removing the internal organs. It was then written that the embalming took an extraordinarily long time. Some modern experts believe this was done to conceal signs of poisoning in the body. One scene from Elizabeth's funeral was etched into the mourner's memory. A wax effigy so masterfully crafted, almost lifelike, was placed upon her coffin that those attending stepped back in astonishment, shuddering at what they saw. The reason for using such an extraordinarily realistic effigy was obvious. The Queen's real body, ravaged by time and years of toxic exposure, was deemed too altered to be shown to the public. Yet the most chilling rumor was preserved in the writings of one of the period's witnesses, Elizabeth Southwell. According to her, the Queen's corpse was so filled with the poisonous residues of the lead and mercury-based cosmetics she had used for years that, during decomposition, an extraordinary amount of gas accumulated and the coffin finally split with a loud crack. This horrific claim was passed down for centuries like a whisper. Some refused to believe it, while others thought it was a conscious effort to conceal the truth about Elizabeth's real body. Modern scientists, rather than dismissing this rumor outright, point to an intriguing fact. Bodies exposed to intense heavy metal poisoning are known to exhibit unusual reactions during decomposition. In other words, the hair-raising incident Southwell recorded may not be mere exaggeration, but a possibility science can explain. All these signs indicate that Elizabeth's cause of death was not a simple illness, but the result of systematic poisoning over decades. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey was sealed in 1606 and has not been opened for more than 400 years. Therefore, any potential forensic evidence inside has yet to be examined. If opened, analyses of hair, tissue, and bone could reveal whether Elizabeth was indeed poisoned by lead and mercury. In the 19th century, Arthur Stanley, who examined the area near the tomb, wrote that the coffin was extraordinarily well preserved. Yet his notes also mention some unusual medical instruments and containers. These are known to have mysteriously disappeared later. Some historians think this was a deliberate destruction of evidence. Reports by foreign envoys also described in detail the Queen's increasingly disfigured appearance. They spoke of blotches on her hands, severe tremors, and profound deterioration in her face. The Queen's wigs, portraits, and court protocols were actually a kind of stage set. Some historians even think that in Elizabeth's final years, body doubles were used because she had become too worn to appear before the public. One of the most striking documents shedding light on the Queen's final years appears in the private notes kept secret by her physician, William Gilbert. These notes record in detail Elizabeth's ever-deepening obsession with cosmetics, the psychological swings that marched hand in hand with bodily collapse, and eventually the failure of her organs one by one. According to Gilbert's lines, as Elizabeth drew near to death, she appeared for the first time in years with a peaceful countenance. Perhaps this serenity stemmed from the end of the illusion of appearance she had been forced to maintain throughout her life. Death granted her the quiet freedom of stepping off the stage. Elizabeth's story can be read as the dramatic tale of one of history's most magnificent queens slowly poisoning herself with her own hands. Yet this is not merely a personal tragedy. It also contains a lesson about the absolute dominion of political power and image, and the deadly prices paid in their name. Today, so long as the lead-sealed tomb in Westminster remains unopened, it seems unlikely that these secrets will ever be confirmed. But one truth is plain. As in life, so in death, Elizabeth managed to control her image with her own hands. And perhaps her greatest secret still lies hidden within that heavy coffin, deep in the darkness and silence.